You are listening to The Addiction Files, where we discuss evidence-based treatment, clinical pearls, and resources while striving to destigmatize the treatment of addiction in our medical culture and save lives. We are the Addiction Doctors, Dr. Darlene Petersen and Paula Cook. Welcome to The Addiction Files. We are back with an episode on caffeine misuse. And particularly, we're going to hone in on energy drinks, but we will talk about the overuse and misuse of these substances, because this is an increasing problem among our patients. By just way of introduction, caffeine in general is just estimating, and this is primarily the US population, but 90% of all adults consume caffeine every day. So this is reported to be the most common stimulant in the world. And this includes in forms like your coffee, tea, soft drinks, or energy drinks, or quote, energy shots, and the widely over-the-counter supplements with sources of caffeine in them. What caffeine does is it suppresses a neurotransmitter, adenosine. And by doing that, what it does is it increases alertness, physical concentration, improves mood and physical performance. So that's why people want to use that. Safe levels of caffeine has been reported to be in adults up to 400 milligrams per day. In children, we're talking 2.5 milligrams per kilogram per day. A confounding factor, though, with these numbers is it is often co-used with nicotine. So that you're combining stimulants. And so that is an important question when we're obtaining histories with patients. And by comparison, and Paula's going to go into a lot more detail on this, energy drinks contain, on average, 50 to up to 500 milligrams per can or bottle, compared to a 170-gram cup of coffee that can contain anywhere from 77 to 150 milligrams of caffeine. So keeping that in mind when we start comparing some of these substances, when we're looking at some of those amounts. And let's go into a little bit of the history, Paula. So tell us, where did this come from and why has this become the most common stimulant in the world?
Well, caffeine is an interesting chemical. And as you said, it's widely used. 90% of the world's population use caffeine. And it can be traced back to originally tea is the first documented beverage that humans consumed with caffeine in it, back to 1000 BC. And this is well documented in Chinese history in the Shang dynasty in the 3rd century AD. And then it was introduced from China, moving west into Europe in the early 16th century via Portuguese explorers and traders, with the British use really increasing in the 15th century. What's really interesting, though, about tea that was originally and still is utilized in China is it was used as fresh green leaves, so green tea as we know it. And it was used as a medicinal tonic through Buddhist history and Buddhist monks and monasteries. There's well-documented utilization of green tea and green tea leaves. And when the British particularly caught wind of tea and its benefits, they basically stole the recipe and smuggled it all the way west. What happened during the passage were the green tea leaves dried and fermented and then formed black tea. So that's actually how we ended up with black tea leaves, which were not, I think obviously Chinese tea, there's multiple kinds of fermented tea, and black tea is now being utilized in China and in the East, but that's how we ended up with primarily black tea in Britain and in the west of Europe, and green tea in Asia. Well, Europeans brought tea to the colonies, including India, where it became a large agricultural endeavor, and then they also brought tea to the American colonies, the US colonies. And I thought this was really fascinating because as an immigrant person to this country who grew up drinking tea. I arrived here and I was like, where's the tea? Why is everyone drinking coffee? I could not understand the
So
obsession
true.
of Americans with coffee. And I was so deprived of tea. I mean, I grew up in Ireland a lot, some of my childhood, and tea is just like water over there. But apparently, what happened, that's highly politicized, but tea was very popular in the US colonies until the American Revolution. And then, because of its association with Britain, it was actually ruled as an unpatriotic drink. And coffee was declared as the hot beverage of choice. So that's kind of, and the same thing as, Canada, they were drinking tea because of their association with the Queen and the Commonwealth. So the Canadians kept drinking tea with their French heritage, their association with the Commonwealth, and the US broke off and became rebellious and drank coffee. And this is why it's taken a long time for tea to kind of cop on in this country. In terms of coffee, which of course really is the quintessential caffeinated drink and even still is, although energy drinks are really contesting with coffee now, dates back, as far as we know, to Ethiopia in 850 AD. And I think this may be my favorite story of all. It was documented from a goat herder in Ethiopia called Calvi, who noticed that his goats were jumping around after eating berries of the Arabica plant. And he's like, something is awry. Something is on with these goats. And he took the berries and he gave them to a monk who concocted a potion. And they all then discovered the benefits of coffee. So I'm now going to, and none of you better steal this idea. I'm going to start a coffee shop called Jumping Goats. I think it's just a brilliant plan. The Jumping Goats coffee shop, but I'll only serve tea. That's the cat. Anyway, there's lots of history of coffee and tea. It moved, it came into, it's been, as I said, energy drink market has really exploded. And there's been a 70% escalation of caffeine ingestion because of energy drinks, basically from the mid 2000s up to now. We're seeing a huge increase in caffeine ingestion from energy drinks and energy shots in children and adolescents, which is actually really distressing. So we've seen a 70% escalation, as I said, from 1977 to 2009. And I think if we got data from 2009 to 2024, we'd see a huge increase. Total energy drink sales globally have been just rising and rising, and they've reached, according to Mayo Clinic, $57 billion by 2020, which I actually do not doubt. I went to Maverick the other day, which is a Utah convenience store gas station chain. And I was looking for a drink like a kombucha or something like that when we were traveling. And I actually could not believe it. They had, I think, 6 or 7 glass refrigerated cases with beverages in them. And 3.5 of them had energy drinks. And then 1.5 had beer. So soda, even soda, as awful as it is contracting in its offerings, I've noticed. And drinks like chocolate, there's always a little bit of like chocolate milk and that kind of thing. So the energy drinks are now the second most popular dietary supplement in the whole of the US, which is crazy. Multiple vitamins are number 1, and energy drinks are number 2, second most sold supplement, according to the FDA. So there's the history, and I think it's only going to increase. And I only copped on really recently to what Celsius drinks are. I guess we're doing advertising for them by talking about it, but I was like, what are these drinks that you see everywhere in the advertising for them? And I've been learning that these drinks are just being touted and marketed as healthy and health drinks because they have vitamins and electrolytes and sparkling water, but they're pretty highly caffeinated. So we're seeing similar and parallel tactics to marketing energy drinks as we are to alcohol. And we've talked a lot about the marketing of alcohol on our podcast before, how akin it is to the marketing that humans were exposed to during the big tobacco era. And we're now seeing that kind of marketing for nicotine, although it's been quashed a little bit by FDA and the government. But now energy drinks are just skyrocketing and they're just dime a dozen, and it's like, what variation do you want? So anyway, that's a brief history, and takeaway is jumping goats, and tea used to be unpatriotic for Americans, but it is no longer.
That is actually really interesting. All right. So tell us a little bit about some of the content of the caffeine levels, because this, I think, is pretty eye-opening, especially as some of us as physicians, and there may be many out there that are very well versed in this, but those of us that do not drink these energy drinks are very naive to the level of caffeine, and also they might just think, well, this is just an easy replacement to my morning cup of coffee. And so I briefly touched on that in our intro, but Paula, tell us sometimes how this compares, because I know you were taking a history from a patient a couple of weeks ago who was consuming 12 to 15 energy drinks a day.
Right.
And when you start adding up just how much caffeine that they're consuming, and then you kind of wonder, like, why then they're coming to you complaining of some of these side effects, which we'll get to.
Right. No, I think this is a good topic. And to give context, let's use coffee, tea, and soda as kind of our baseline because, in reality,
Most are familiar with that. Yeah.
right. And in reality, coffee has a lot of caffeine. And a lot of us drink coffee.
It
And
makes goats jump. So, yeah.
yeah, makes me jump. This is why I don't drink coffee. So typical coffee, and you'll actually find a big variation of reported caffeine amounts in coffee. And in fact, just in general, it's very difficult to really quantify milligrams of caffeine in any product, and they're often mislabeled or not labeled at all, or incorrectly labeled. And even coffee, you could get a vague idea, but really it depends on the roast, it depends on the beans, it depends on how strong you brew it. So, same with tea to a certain extent. I think we could be fairly certain about the milligrams of caffeine in soda. But for types of coffee, so if you just have brewed filter coffee, now depending on the roast, if you have a dark roast for 1 cup of coffee, so 8 ounces of coffee, it's about 100 milligrams, 8 ounces. If you have a blonde roast or a light roast, it really increases 2 to 3 times the amount of
Wow.
caffeine. If you have an espresso, so a shot or in a latte, basically an espresso shot, like a 60 ml espresso shot, which is 2 shots of coffee, you're getting about 126 milligrams of caffeine there. And if you're getting like an espresso pod, using one of the pods or Keurig, you're getting about 65 to 70 milligrams of caffeine. Now, if you look at commercially sold coffees, we'll just go over this really quickly because we could do this all day. Commercially sold coffees, again, because of the kinds of roast and the size that we typically consume, most of us don't go to Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or our local brewery and buy 8 ounces of coffee. Most of us don't. So if you go to Starbucks and get a 20-ounce Pike's Place roast, there is 410 milligrams of caffeine in that. So, if you go to Dunkin' Donuts and get a same size regular coffee, drip coffee from Dunkin' Donuts, 270 milligrams. Okay. So there's quite a lot of caffeine in commercially produced coffee drinks. One more of those little examples is like a Starbucks mocha or latte is about 175 milligrams for 16 ounces of a mocha or a latte. So a lot more than what I just read for a double shot. Well, what about tea? So tea it's fairly standard, and the color of the tea will dictate the amount of caffeine. That's a good rule of thumb. 6 to 8 ounce cup of black tea has 50 milligrams of caffeine. And oolong tea has a little bit less than that. Green tea has 20 to 30 milligrams. And white tea has a very small amount of caffeine. The only tea that really is very strongly caffeinated is yerba mate, which has about 50% of the caffeine of the same volume of coffee. So tea is caffeinated. I mean, black tea is caffeinated. What's interesting is tea, a lot of people can tolerate tea, but they can't tolerate coffee. And there's a reason to this. Then I was reading about this today, and it has to do with the formulation, but mostly probably due to the other effects of chemicals that are in tea. So tea is well known for containing L-theanine, which is very calming and anxiolytic. So probably has some kind of a negating effect on the caffeine versus just drinking straight coffee. Okay, really quickly, how much caffeine does soda have in it? 12-ounce Mountain Dew, whether it's diet or regular, has 54 milligrams of caffeine, which I'm actually surprised by that, Darlene. It seems like it's more than that. And then a can of,
Sodas, regular sodas are surprisingly, compared to our other substances, are
yeah,
surprisingly low in
I know.
caffeine.
And yet it seems like, yeah, and same as with Coke. Coke, Diet Coke, regular Coke, about 45, 46 milligrams, Dr. Pepper, 41, Pepsi, even less than that. Coke, zero, 34 milligrams. So I don't know. It seems like, and I don't drink soda, but when I do, boy, I can just have like quarter of a can of Coke and I'm like buzzing for a while. Okay, so let's go to energy drinks. So really the high standard is coffee, especially if you're going for light roast coffees from somewhere like Starbucks. You really can get a lot of caffeine. So when you're taking a history, it's good to know how much people are drinking, because if they say, well, I drink a pot of coffee or half a pot of coffee, a pot of coffee has about 800 milligrams of caffeine. So if people are brewing a pot or a carafe and they're drinking half of that in the morning, then they're getting 400 plus, which is about what you said is your limit. So when we look at some popular energy drinks, and the big thing to remember about energy drinks, and you're going to talk about this, it's not just the energy drink you're getting when you're drinking it, right?
Okay.
Just in terms of pure milligrams of caffeine. So there are energy drinks, which come with, liquid and everything else in them, 12 ounce, 16 ounce. And then there are energy shots, and that are maybe more concentrated. So some of the more common ones that I recognize, I don't drink these, so I'm not like, oh yeah, I've had a red line, but a 5-hour energy extra strength shot has 230 milligrams of caffeine. Celsius, those drinks I was just mentioning, they are 12 ounces and they have 200 milligrams. And boy, are those easy to throw back. Have you seen those? They look like sparkling water. Monster drinks, which is what a lot of my folks drink, have 160 milligrams, and rock stars have 160 milligrams. But if you get into some of the really caffeinated energy drinks like Red Line Extreme, 8 ounces of that has 316 milligrams of caffeine, and A Shock and Bang, those products have about 300. And then, of course, what was interesting and kind of shocking to me is that there are now many products that are like health products, quotation marks, that actually have been caffeinated. So V8 is making a
Yes.
caffeinated beverage with 80 milligrams of caffeine. Ocean Spray cranberry juice is making one with 75 grams. And then, of course, the ever famous Red Bull, is just kind of touted as like a health drink for athletes. In fact, Ironman uses this on its course, which I have to say I'm not always unhappy about. When you're at mile 20 on the run, you need a bit of Red Bull, but has 80 milligrams for 8 ounces. So you brought it up that many people do not only drink one a day. So you may think, well, that's not very much, Red Bull only has 80 milligrams, but many people will drink 3, 4, 5 Red Bulls a day. And then you're just
Like,
multiplying that risk.
yeah. Well, and it's interesting, you touched on this. Many of them they contain other stuff in them. And especially now that they're trying to nudge their way into this quote unquote health food market or supplement market. And they commonly cane guarana, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, but this is another stimulant by itself. And it was commonly used by Brazil. It's a Brazilian indigenous people use this as a stimulant. And the guarana seeds notably surpass coffee beans as far as caffeine content. And why that's important is you have the caffeine that is listed in that amount, and then guarana is listed as another ingredient. So you're not getting the total amount of stimulant or caffeine in there. So, for instance, if you have your drink that says it has 300 milligrams of caffeine and you're really trying to stay under these recommended limits, Well, when you have guarana in there, you're getting additional on there. And that's why you can see these adverse events, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So, and you start going through and looking at some of these, many of them are contained multiple of these other kind of stimulants. And so, because that's what we keep asking, and when as we start reading through the studies, is why is this different? Why are some people where they can tolerate actually quite high levels of coffee or tea, or they're thrown back, like we can see high numbers, like some people will just adjust their use on soda intake, and you see that's quite sometimes lower levels, but they will just adjust and drink quite a bit more to make up for that, but they don't seem to have as much of this effect. Well, because it's these other substances that we'll talk about. So common are adverse events from caffeine. The hard thing is this is something that there's not widespread. Most of these are kind of retrospective studies and sometimes surveys, but for these come from literature reviews, and then from the CDC is where we got a lot of our statistics. But 70% of children and adolescents have had report increased use of caffeine, and that is continues to go on the rise. So 1/3 of teens 12 to 17 are reporting use of energy drinks. So that's what is concerning when we just talked about the level of caffeine in those. And interestingly, ages 18 to 34 are the ones that are consuming the most energy drinks. And I would agree, like that's the age group that we're probably seeing in our population. From 2007 to 2011, energy drink related emergency room visits doubled. And of those, 1 in 10 resulted in hospitalization. So it's best to think about adverse effects from caffeine in each organ system. And it was really helpful, an article that came out in the Journal of Nutrients in September of 2023. And this was from Constantino, titled The Dark Side of Energy Drinks, a comprehensive review of their impacts on the human body. And I really liked how they broke this down by organ systems. So the effects on the cardiovascular systems is the most studied of all the effects of these substances, due to obviously its potential risk of fatal properties. So they cited in this study the European Cardiac Arrhythmia Society. It's taken several critical reviews and reported data on energy drinks in particular, and and their reports on some possible cause and effect relationships. And high consumption of energy drinks has been associated with some acute hemodynamic and adrenergic states, which in turn increases glucose and norepinephrine levels. So that's some of the mechanism of action. So you have this kind of high adrenergic state, high and increased norepinephrine levels, and associated supraventricular and ventricular arrhythmias is what we're most familiar with, coronary vasospasm, and then they've even seen ischemia, myocardial infarction, some report of atrial fibrillation, syncope, aortic dissection, and cardiomyopathy and cardiac arrest, and sudden cardiac death in otherwise young and healthy individuals. And you'll see increased heart rate and blood pressure resulting, and that's frequently what we observe just in the office. And you can see sometimes some quite prolonged effects, and especially with this frequent use, and then going back to the co-use of nicotine, because that's a very common, especially that 18 to 34 men, that's 18 to 34 age group. So it's very, very common with that. And then looking at kidneys, so they've seen, acute kidney injury, you've seen hyperglycemia, you can see decreased potassium, metabolic acidosis, and acute tubular necrosis. So eye side effects are interesting. And the mechanism of action that was proposed is you get a saturation of nicotinic acid receptors and high serum levels of niacin. So this is particular to energy drinks because of those other substances that we talked about that also are contained in energy drinks. And then you get stimulation of gastric H2 receptors, particularly by this is the caffeine directly, and then stimulation of the gastrointestinal myenteric plexus by the taurine. And so, though again, that comes in, that's particular to energy drinks. And then there's the direct tissue toxicity. So you get the hypercobalanemia, and that's from excessive B12 intake. You can get atrophic gastritis. They even report some cases of pancreatitis, hepatitis. Those were noted in a higher incidence with people who already had comorbidities, so such as things as diabetes, sometimes combining this with other substance use. This is particularly in our patients who also suffer with other substance uses, so alcohol use disorders. But where we're seeing that we're combining this already with alcohol, but many of our patients who are already co-using this makes this concerning because we're seeing co-use of both of this and also at high levels. So that's why this was what was interesting is you see a higher risk of these really kind of devastating side effects. Logic effects. So you get an increased release of epinephrine, norepinephrine, which is why people like the effect of caffeine, but you can get a big release. So that can also result in the anxiety, the tremors, and the shaking, and sweating. And so that can be quite profound with really excessive and overdose levels. Does that make sense? And they have seen even psychosis and obviously we see the anxiety and increase of panic disorder, and obviously insomnia. That's where this comes from. They've seen hyperglycemia, hypokalemia that we touched on already, a metabolic acidosis. You can even see there has been reports of leukocytosis associated with this. You get an overall just this overstimulation of the whole adrenergic system. And that's where that's coming from. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the neurological effects. An additional risk is there are products coming out that are combining alcohol with caffeine. And as we know, this is a really disturbing phenomenon, don't you think, Paula? That risky drinking, particularly we see this in that little bit younger population that seems, well, it's marketed number one to college age, but they have seen 25% of college students are consuming alcohol with energy drinks, or they're consuming those products that have already combined alcohol and caffeine together. And CDC reported that 15 to 23-year-olds that are mixing alcohol with energy drinks are more likely, one, to binge drink. They're 4 times more likely to participate in the high intensity drinking. And if you recall, high intensity drinking meaning drinking 6 or more drinks in a setting. And then binge and high intensity drinking results in more of risky behaviors. So they're more likely to report driving while intoxicating or being a passenger in a vehicle with somebody who is driving while intoxicated, more alcohol related injuries, participating in unwanted or unprotected sex. So these are really 25% is quite high and really just disturbing in that risky behavior. So I think that's another area to monitor and then educate our patients, especially when we're seeing those trends. Right. So talk to us a little bit. We've talked about some of the adverse events, and then how do we treat this?
Well, I mean, I think we treat anything that's being overused compulsively. The thing with caffeine, I guess, is it's a substance that the brain does gain tolerance to, and there's actually caffeine use disorder, the DSM-5. So you gain tolerance and you have withdrawal syndrome from caffeine. You may not have negative consequences, or you might. I mean, you might have physical consequences like Darlene just reviewed. Maybe you have financial consequences. I mean, I see people in clinic all the time who have hypertension, tachycardia. They have dental issues, hyperglycemia, prediabetes, metabolic syndrome
Yeah.
because of the amount of sugar that they're
Yes.
consuming from the energy drinks. Some of them have up to 65 grams of sugar per can. And if you're drinking multiple energy drinks a day, this is a big problem. I mean, this goes for very sweet coffee drinks as well and tea drinks. So really puts a risk, puts us at health risk. So treating it like any other substance use disorder in terms of like recognizing the problem, brief intervention, seeing if people are willing to change their behavior and why. So using motivational interviewing to lever what they might want to change about their use. So would you consider changing the amount of coffee you drink? And why would you? So get them to identify why they would want to change. Same thing with energy drinks. I think this issue with college students, high schoolers, and younger drinking a lot of energy drinks just by themselves and landing in the ED with tachycardia and supraventricular arrhythmias is a huge problem. And we have to educate parents and families and kids on the risks of the drinks themselves. And then, of course, this combination of energy drinks with alcohol is just a huge problem. And I would hazard to say that 25% is low. I think 25% of college students is probably now a low estimate because the combination is so clever. I mean, you're getting the relaxed buzz from alcohol with the stimulant and up all night party from the energy drink. So, makes sense that this is how people are drinking alcohol. And we have other data coming from that Canadian study that kids are not only people who use energy drinks, not only binge drink, but they also are more associated to smoke cigarettes, incident ratio of 3.7. Cannabis is increased with people who use energy drink 2.9, as well as binge drinking. So there's a lot of association there that comes from a study from Sampasa Kayinga and all from the International Journal of Environmental Public Health in 2020. So I think knowing the risks, educating, brief intervention, seeing if people are willing to change their behavior, and then addressing the withdrawal syndrome that comes from caffeine, which is real and it's mostly headaches. So we all know about caffeine withdrawal headaches, which can be really severe. I remember as a resident in our residency having to treat caffeine withdrawal headaches pretty aggressively in
Yeah.
people. And then, of course, people have fatigue and they have mental brain fog and lack of concentration. And they may actually feel depressed because caffeine, unlike, some other, it's a mood elevator. So it
Yeah.
makes people feel happy and like they can get on with their day. So addressing what is healthy, what is safe. And we're not saying that all caffeinated beverages are bad for you. Energy drinks, I don't think you could argue that there's really a healthy energy drink out there, but coffee and tea definitely have health benefits as long as they are used for people who don't otherwise have a contraindication like GERD or gastritis. And if they're not using them in the amount where the caffeine is superseding 400 milligrams or whatever the amount is appropriate for you as a human. Like I can't have more than like 50 milligrams of caffeine. Personally, it makes me jittery and anxious. So I just know that. When we look at the world of insomnia, this is where it is huge to do a caffeine evaluation and inquiry on all your patients because it's almost certainly at play, especially when people don't understand the half-life of caffeine being 6 to 8 hours. So however much caffeine they've had all day is still around by the time they try and go to bed, and then they're metabolizing it even still the next morning when they start caffeinating again. So treatment, I think, is largely around education, motivational interviewing, advising people to slowly taper off of caffeine rather than going cold turkey. There doesn't seem to be a great benefit to going cold turkey unless they have some terrible health reason, like they have a tachyarrhythmia or acute renal failure. But I'd say that that would be the approach we would recommend.
No, I think that's fantastic. And it is, I think, one, like you said, Paula, taking a good history and then reviewing what side effects that they're having and recognizing that mood dysphoria can be common. Right? What else haven't we covered?
I think that's it.
Okay. Well, great. That was a great little lesson on caffeine misuse. Thank you so much and have a great night. Until next time. Hey, check us out at theaddictionfiles.com or email us at theaddictionfiles@gmail.com. Thank you so much to Ricky Valades for use of his song Awake. Check him out at rickyvalades.com.
Content of the podcast are for entertainment and education purposes only. Hosts and guests are not responsible for any harm caused by information obtained from this source. As each person is unique, you're advised to seek the advice of your own healthcare professional to treat any medical conditions you may be having. Opinions expressed on this show are those of the Addiction Files and not of our respective employers.